Hello, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video, we are going to talk all things poptimism, what it is, where it came from, the height of it, the peak of it, and whether or not it still exists. Maybe not so much whether it exists anymore, but whether its job has been done or whether it's something that necessarily needs to have as much of a place in today's, I want to say musical climate, we can say pop climate, either way. Let's go ahead and get into the video. To begin with, poptimism isn't just referring to pop music that has a positive theme or message. It's the idea that, from a music criticism standpoint, that pop music can have merit in its own right. Poptimism rose as a response to rockism, as for a while, maybe even still to an extent, pop and rock have been seen on opposite ends of the music binary, if you will. At one point, like in the 50s and 60s, rock and roll essentially was pop, as it was the most dominant genre, and what we would call pop music today didn't really exist back then. And still, even for decades after, rock was often seen as more genuine, more representative of someone's perspective on the state of the world, and more artistic, whereas pop was often seen as thoughtless, artificial, and purely commercial. There was also the thought that rock artists had to be talented, as in being able to sing and play an instrument, probably also write their lyrics, whereas a pop star could have a career without being able to do any of those things. According to the New York Times, poptimism rose in prominence because around the 80s, moving into the 90s, pop started to be seen as a more welcome and opening space, especially in comparison to the often white male-dominated rock spaces. Additionally, there was the rise of vocal powerhouses and lyricists who didn't necessarily align with disco, house, even soul, genres like that, though they might have utilized them, but they moreover identified as a pop artist. As pop as we know it became more popular, and in turn a little more respected, many music reviewers reoriented how they wrote about pop music. In some cases, they simply began to write about it at all, since for a while pop wasn't thought to be genuine art, therefore not even worthy of a review. This change was in part to avoid alienating audiences, many of whom were pop fans, from not wanting to read a publication because artists were shredded simply for making pop. Especially in the later 90s and 2000s, when a large portion of those watching music shows, flocking to music publications, especially the really mainstream ones, were younger people, many of whom, of course, like pop. A couple weeks ago, in Pop Heads, of course, someone was talking about Teenage Dream as a perfect pop album, and probably one of the last that will see breaking organic records the way that it did. And of course, it was brought up that despite that, the album received a 6.8 out of 10 on Pitchfork. Apparently, it's basically a meme now that 6.8 is a score Pitchfork often gives albums when they don't know what to score it. But several have pointed out that while a 6.8 might seem low, that was a relatively good score for a time when pop music wasn't as respected, and pop stars like Katy and Britney, even if their music was more suggestive and quote-unquote adult, their music was still kind of thought of as for kids. I saw people say, oh, a 6.8 wasn't bad for the time, for the climate, but the review was actually written in 2021. And then it was also pointed out that maybe it was for the better that Pitchfork waited until 2021 to score Teenage Dream, because it's very likely that had they scored it back in 2010, it would have got a much lower score. Pitchfork didn't even review Teenage Dream when it came out in the summer of 2010. And last summer, Tom Brehane, who used to work for Pitchfork, noted this when he finally reviewed the title track for Serial Gum's The Number Ones. He said, "At the time, the Pitchfork higher-ups had decided that Katy Perry was insufficiently cool. Ryan sent me the song because he instantly loved it, and he thought I'd instantly love it. He was right." And to be fair, when Pitchfork was founded in 1996, the publication intended to cover alternative and indie music, so pop wasn't on their radar. But I guess you could also argue that's just because pop wasn't as respected. They didn't review their first pop album until 2002, which was Kylie Minogue's Fever, and it was done as an April Fool's joke. The review was originally uploaded with the site banner saying Pitchfork had been bought, and so some of their content would shift. The review itself was genuine, but Pitchfork considering a pop album deserving a review at all, that was the joke. The opening line does have that typical Pitchfork snark as it reads, "The woman who brought American audiences that terribly rigid version of the locomotion in the late 80s has risen from the dead, or massive overseas popularity depending on how you look at it, to sock it to the red, white, and blue just like she did 15 summers ago." Okay, so that may not have been Kylie Minogue's primary motivation behind Fever, her 9th album overall, but it's probably going to be the subject of the most press she gets in the US. They did rate the album a 7.6 though, which is actually pretty good, and I do believe it's her highest rated album on Pitchfork still. Just last year, Pitchfork noted their April Fool's joke of reviewing Fever was a turning point, as they would go on to review more pop albums. Part of the reason I bring this up is that now it's basically the norm to see commentary on how Pitchfork rated a pop album. I see commentary on their pop reviews probably more than any other genre actually, when at their inception they didn't even cover pop and their foray into covering pop was a joke. This expansion into covering other genres was swift because for 2003, artists like Beyonce, Justin Timberlake, and Outkast topped their best songs list. It is interesting to note, though, that for the most part, a lot of the so-called pop albums that were well received at this point, not just by Pitchfork, involved some sort of genre fusion and didn't usually lead with an album being a pop album. And now, a couple of decades later, we're more comfortable classifying these albums as pop, even if we would also call them other genres, because there's less of a stigma against pop music. In the mid-2000s, artists like Robyn and Nelly Furtado, amongst so many others, also put out their own pop albums to positive reviews. Nelly Furtado's Loose, for example, was noted by Pitchfork to be one of the best and worst pop albums of 2006, actually claiming the pop songs on the album were the strongest and the ballads the weakest. They also claim that Nelly's music likely took this shift because after her sophomore album, she needed a hit and also some positive press around her music, and a series of dark punching pop songs could provide that for her. Robyn is a name that gets brought up quite a bit in the Poptimism conversation, and for good reason. After going independent and shifting to a more electronic synth-pop sound, she's been hailed by critics as one of the most influential figures in pop, even if some were unaware they're inspired by her. Most of Robyn's pop is upbeat and electronic, perfect for the dance floor, but still paired with personal and poignant lyrics, often about self-doubt or heartbreak. Think some of her most popular songs like Call Your Girlfriend or Dancing on My Own, both of which come from her 2010 album Body Talk, which is thought to be one of the album's most representative of Poptimism in terms of its reception. While making the album, Robyn and her producers watched a lot of documentaries of rock groups like the Beatles and Pink Floyd making their albums, and wanted to spend as much time and care making Body Talk just to prove a pop album could be made with as much meticulousness. Writer and producer Klaus Allen said, "The documentaries would be like, we worked on this song for 3 whole weeks in the studio, or we just did backing vocals for 4 days, and nothing they would throw at me sounded weird compared to what we were doing. We were very self-indulgent and almost like progressive rock of the early 70s minded." But Body Talk wasn't Robyn's first pop album, that was her 2005 self-titled album. Off that 2005 album, listening to songs like Be Mine, you can definitely hear Robyn's influence in songs that artists like Ariana Grande, Carly Rae Jepsen, Rihanna, and even Taylow Swift would eventually release. The Guardian said about the album, "At a time when a new generation of music critics were starting to question the received wisdom that pop was less authentic than rock, Robyn's musically adventurous, heart-piercing hits chalked one up for Poptimism, making indie nerds lighten up and revealing teeny bopper fare to be thin gruel." So still, you can kind of see that there's more respect for Robyn's type of pop, that more introspective indie pop, because there's more quote-unquote substance, so to speak, as compared to the more mainstream pop, but I guess the idea of pop in general even being able to have substance is still a positive step. I saw several writers of the opinion that Poptimism, bolstered by albums like Body Talk, reached its peak in the mid-2010s, especially around 2014 when albums like 1989 were released. Part of the reason for this is that 1989 was such a cultural moment that even if Taylor Swift or pop in general wasn't your thing, you've likely still heard at least a few of the album's singles. And rather than write off the album and its popularity as teeny bopper fare, as that Guardian article put it, critics actually did examine the album and many did review it favorably. By 2014, pop was seen as a more respectable genre, one where you could still be taken seriously by critics to a much higher degree than even a decade ago. An artist could also more openly brand themselves as a pop star, even a mainstream one, and not just a musician who maybe dabbled in a little pop and could still expect to have their work at least looked at as worthy of a review. According to The Guardian, Poptimism even made it so that many more pop stars weren't mainstream top 40, but could make critically acclaimed music, often with a cult following, as is pretty common in genres like rock or hip-hop. And examples of artists like Sia, Charlie XCX, and Lorde were given. And though all of them had a top 40 smash hit, well, top 10 honestly, even back in 2014, I feel like they're good examples of pop artists who have been able to remain relevant for a decade as primarily pop acts, though they're not dominating the mainstream as we tend to think when we think of a typical pop star. And I would think this is possible for several reasons. One, because people value pop more now, some are more likely to seek out pop acts they like, as they probably would with other genres, rather than have their radio or charts exclusively tell them what to enjoy. Also, because of this, a lot of pop stars don't have to be the most mainstream, stereotypical pop star ever in order to have a decent following or career. Also, and this is just my personal opinion, I feel like the rise of more serious pop, or sad girl music as they used to be more common to call it, raised pop overall in a lot of people's estimations. Because there are quite a few people, and this is even true with critics, who will be like, I don't like that Britney Spears type pop, but I love Lana Del Rey or the Lorde type stuff. And more recently, you see a pretty similar sentiment with people who say, oh, I don't like pop usually, but I like Billie Eilish or I like Olivia Rodrigo. And I do think that that's what that review from The Guardian was talking about when they felt that Robyn's pop music was the opposite of teeny bopper. I think another great example of this was Carly Rae Jepsen's Emotion, which came out in the summer of 2015 in the midst of Poptimism's peak. Though the album was critically acclaimed, it was considered a commercial failure. I've said it before and I'll say it again, choosing I Really Like You as the lead single probably hurt the album a lot more than it helped, because its closeness to Call Me Maybe made Carly look like a one-trick pop pony. But still, the album made it into the top 10 on Time, Rolling Stone, Cosmopolitan, and Stereogum's list of 2015's best albums. Emotion was praised as near-perfect pop and complimented for the fact that the 80s synth-pop and indie-pop inspired album felt like a genuine effort, not one only intending to repackage nostalgia. The album, like Carly Rae Jepsen herself, now has a cult following, with a lot of people considering Emotion a great example of an underrated or generally overlooked album. In pop heads, I even saw cases being made that Emotion and its critical success is a stronger example of Poptimism than 1989 or even Body Talk. The argument for this was that when looking at the impacts of Emotion, it didn't start a wave of synth pop revival because it already existed, looking back to artists like Robyn, but was a case of critics actually seeing the merit of not just a pop album, but a pop album marketed as pure pop and one that wasn't attached to a main pop girl per se, nor was the album's acclaim focused on one smash hit from the album. And truly it was the opposite. Emotion is considered a strong album despite the most popular track on it. Around the turn of the decade, it seems there were more articles published that weren't really talking about the rise of Poptimism, examples of Poptimism, but whether Poptimism is still a thing currently and questioning some of its impacts. And again, this isn't a conversation on the quality of pop music, but on how it's written about and critiqued. And looking at a lot of these opinions, which we'll break down, I'm wondering how many of them have to do with just pop music or more of a commentary on how we consume and critique media in general, because I saw a lot of overlap. Even all the way back in 2014 when we were in that peak Poptimism phase, I did find an article published by the New York Times mentioning how much of a role social media plays in Poptimism and how much it can potentially affect the way that a writer approaches a review or a critique. And arguably, social media plays even more of a role now than it did back in 2014 when things like Stan Twitter were still in their fledgling days. And also, like I mentioned, the shift in coming to respect pop music had to do somewhat with publications noticing more and more people were consuming pop, enjoying it, and not only that, but being very vocal about it. This, of course, scared some reviewers out of senselessly ripping apart pop offerings for the sake of being pop, and even in cases where the critic was being genuine, being more diplomatic in their critique. For a few years at this point, it's been relatively common for fans to mobilize online if an artist receives a negative review, even if it is a genuine one. So of course, a lot of writers don't want to deal with being harassed or doxxed, and many publications overall would rather keep people coming to the site with reviews that may contain some negative critique but are overall generous. But on the other hand, some publications do thrive off having a controversial headline or review because we know often those get clicks just the same. Tying this back into Poptimism, it was pointed out that because of this, it seems like a lot of reviews of pop songs and albums have become overwhelmingly positive, and maybe even often undeservedly positive, because for a while it was seen as a no-no to harshly critique pop, lest you be labeled a pop-hating snob. I'm not fully sure what to make of this yet, but I do think it's relevant. While discussing 1989 and Poptimism more generally, the blog Deep Red Music brought up the point that it seems like one effect of Poptimism was that throughout the 2010s, several publications named pop or pop-blended songs as their top songs of the year. He wrote, "Poptimism has thoroughly permeated the ends of the blogosphere to the point that praise for the likes of Taylow Swift, Beyonce, and Carly Rae Jepsen has become the modus operandi of most music criticism. The fact that Pitchfork bestowed its #1 song of 2013 to Hold On We're Going Home by Drake, perhaps today's biggest pop juggernaut, would have been unheard of a few years ago. It's no longer an embarrassing display of naivete to love Call Me Maybe your teenage dream. It's a sign that you're an impartial judge." So a lot to unpack here. One, no one is ever going to universally agree on what the year's best song was. And to be fair, I did like Hold On We're Going Home when it came out, but bias removed, I was like, okay, make a case for this song being the best song of 2013. Even in terms of pop or hip hop alone, that was a stacked year. But really, what are the odds the best song released in a whole year, even in one genre, even in one region of the world, also happens to be a massively popular song? I would bet we have heard some of the best, most innovative, or just well-constructed music, but I think it's also logical to assume the general public hasn't heard the best offerings of any given year, no matter how subjective that is. But on the other hand, from the standpoint of a publication, it doesn't go over well with fans whose clicks, reads, subscriptions they depend on if their song of the year is one very few people have heard of. And while editing, I was reminded of Bonnie Raitt winning Song of the Year at the Grammys, I believe in 2023, and everyone getting upset and being like, who is that? Who is that? even though that shouldn't necessarily factor in as to whether someone should win that award or not, but obviously it is something that happens. And if you're curious, because I was, here are Pitchfork's top song of the year going back to 2010. Out of the 14 songs, the majority are pop, albeit different types of pop. Then there's some hip hop as well, and of course a few songs that fuse both. Most of these songs definitely were pretty popular, some even mainstream and some even topping the charts. But like I was saying earlier, two things can be true. A song can follow a trend and still be a good song. It can be pop and still be good, but there are definitely some crowd pleasers here, even if I could easily make a case for the song being good, or I do personally enjoy it. And to be fair, the overall lists are pretty diverse since they contain 100 songs each, but like I mentioned, it would be a bit bad for business for no one to really know what the top song is, even if it was deemed the best on merit. And forum girly to my core, y'all know that, so I was looking in on a conversation on Poptimism that was taking place on Pop Justice back in 2020. And I do agree with most of what was said. I wanted to share part of this comment that sums up things pretty well in my opinion. It reads, "It's important to remember the benefits of posting positive pop content by media outlets. These places desperately need clicks and engagement, and to be part of the conversation to stay relevant. Pop stans are easily the most active online and on socials compared to any other genre, and as you mentioned, that can be weaponized. An article on Charlie XCX is going to get more viewers than an article on, say, The National, despite Charlie selling a fraction of the albums or tickets of the other. A glowing 5-star pop girl review or avant-garde photo shoot that gives the gays everything they want is going to get retweeted, shared, quoted, because we obsess and hold up our faves in a way other genres simply don't. We're doing their work for these outlets, and it's healthy to be suspicious of that because it skews the coverage in ways that aren't necessarily beneficial to us as fans." And I do agree, Poptimism in some ways has possibly negatively affected the way pop music is talked about, as has been pointed out. One example I can think of is how a lot of expectations for pop reviews are skewed. I see it often. Fans freak out when an album they think is amazing only gets like a 7 on Pitchfork, maybe an 8, and likewise a Metacritic score of something in the 70s, 80s. They think it's a terrible score or an unfair one, when in reality that would still mean the album was considered above average, regardless of genre. Usually in response, a person or two will point out that 1, those are not bad scores like I just said, and 2, it's also relatively recent that a pop album, even an excellent one, would even be scored that high at all, likely due in part to Poptimism. Something else I was thinking about is that in some ways the reason people review music has changed and the reason many consume these reviews has changed. And because of that, it's likely that the nature of these reviews themselves has also changed. One, quite a lot of people who offer their pop opinions online, myself included, aren't typically tied to a publication, so they don't have to worry about upholding the reputation of said publication, whether they're pro-pop or anti-pop or certain artists, and that affecting how they review. And yeah, maybe that can lead to a more honest review, maybe a more dishonest one, but overall, a lot of these opinions are seen as lower stakes. Also, mostly because of streaming, very rarely is someone's review the difference between someone going out to buy that music or not. I do think if we went back to the days of having to buy music, if we wanted to hear it on our own time, the nature of some of these reviews would change again. Even speaking for myself, I do think most pop music is decent at minimum, obviously biased because I enjoy pop music, but I wouldn't say I would spend my money on every pop song that I do genuinely find decent, good, or even enjoyable, and likely wouldn't tell other people to. All that being said, maybe within the last few years or so, it does feel like pop music critique has become slightly more balanced, and it's in a way trickled down to how some fans react to these reviews and even form their own opinions. It's not perfect, the stands will still stand, the hate reviewers will still do that, they have even before the internet existed, but I do feel like I've seen more genuine critiques, even from fans of an artist, rather than simply saying this thing is good because someone I like made it, this thing is bad because someone I don't like made it. Also, I would just think a lot of us don't see pop stars as infallible anymore, if we ever did, and sort of the cult around them amplified to hell by stan culture. It still exists, but not necessarily to the extent that I would say it did even 5 years ago. It also may be the case soon, if it hasn't happened yet, that some of these writers who review for publications aren't as influenced by Poptimism. Because I do feel like for most people around my age, we would agree that pop has always been relatively accepted for most of our lifetimes, probably as accepted as it ever will be, and we've spent our lives with it being a dominant genre. And while researching, it was brought up a couple times, not by reviewers but by pop fans themselves, whether Poptimism is needed anymore. Some of the most acclaimed newer artists are also pop stars, and when they put out work, many of them can't expect a genuine review. For every review calling a pop album terrible or uninspired, there are others calling these albums innovative and impactful. Some of the most acclaimed songs each year are pop songs, but on the other hand, so are the most reviled. Speaking for myself, I personally do think in a lot of ways Poptimism's job has been done, because for reviewers it's basically common sense now. You would approach reviewing or speaking about a pop album the way you would any other genre, of course if you are reviewing in good faith, rather than it just being the norm to overlook the genre entirely. It's a more widely held belief that not all pop is just vapid, overproduced commercial earworms, and it's a genre of music with great songs, terrible songs, interesting songs, bland songs, just like any other. As always, do be sure to let me know your thoughts, let me know your feelings. Do you think the Poptimism pendulum is swinging back, if you will, or do you think that we are very much still in a state of Poptimism, maybe even peak Poptimism again? I want to leave you with an interesting tidbit. Apparently, Pitchfork has never reviewed a Britney Spears album, which I think is interesting because she released several albums after they decided to cover pop in 2002. I'm thinking Blackout and In the Zone especially. Maybe it's for the better because knowing what I know of Pitchfork, I don't really see them scoring it well, but that was just something that was intriguing to me. As always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so that you can stick around for more. And if you'd like to become a channel member and get early access to videos, the link is in the description. Again, thank you so much for watching. I love you all so very much, and we'll see you so very soon. Bye-bye.